So let's talk about the Impressionists. Impressionism was a movement that was started in 1874. It was started by a loose band of artists who exhibited together for about 12 years. The leader of the group was Claude Monet, and it began in France in about 1870 and went to 1890. It started in France. England had some Impressionists, but the US also had Impressionists. Typically, when we think about Impressionist work, we think about landscapes and cityscapes. We think about images of urban life, leisure activities. Stylistic features tend to be the fleeting effects of light and the influence of Japanese prints. Now, there are certain rules that the Impressionists followed, and we'll talk about them here in a minute. Impressionism had some important things in terms of society that happened around it. One of those things, obviously, being the Industrial Revolution. With industrialization came urbanization. Life during the Impressionist movement for the upper class was leisurely. And there was a sense of self-conscious modernity and modernism. So the Impressionists begin as an anonymous society. They had an exhibition in 1874. It was only seen by about 3,500 people, and it opened a few days before the Salon opened. It drew about 400,000 or so visitors, and amongst those visitors was a man named Louis Leroy. He was an art critic, and he walked along and felt that the Impressionists didn't really paint. He said the Impressionists didn't really paint, but they painted impressionisms of a sunrise or an impressionism of a lake. And so Louis Leroy coins them the Impressionists. He does this based on this painting you see here by Claude Monet called Sunrise. Impressionists followed some rules. They were called Impressionist ethics. They had a desire to only paint in plein air, which meant that they painted outside in front of the thing that they were painting. They also painted alla prima, which means painting directly on the canvas. They banished the color black from their palette and used this new bright set of colors that had now become available in pre-mixed paint tubes. That happened because of industrialization. They only depicted modern subject matter that had interest to the realists. And above anything else, they did not want to submit their work to the Salon. Here you see Monet's. Impressionism is an interesting movement today in that many people absolutely love Impressionism, including we see that Monet has crackers named after him. If you go to if you go to Amazon and you search for Monet, it will come up with 45,112 results. If you search for Manet, it'll ask you if you meant Monet. If you tell it you meant Monet, I think it comes up with about 50 results. Oh, I'm sorry. If you tell it you're looking for Manet, it comes up with less than 2,000 books related to him here. And this is Claude Monet. He was perhaps the most dedicated of the plein air painters in that century. He constantly tried to capture the brief and fleeting effects of light through color. And he suffered some pretty serious financial hardships for most of the 1870s and 1880s. He was highly influenced by William Turner, who we discussed in the Romanticism period. You can see Turner's love for this palette of this beautiful, bright, chromatic, orangish red color juxtaposed with that yellow color. When you look at his painting in Sunrise, this one that was named that named the era that Louis Leroy saw, and he coined them Impressionists. You see the same color palette that Turner used. Now he has his own take on it, but he still loves that bright orangish color juxtaposed with this light blue color. Here's a close-up of that orange color that you can see that Monet takes pretty directly from Turner's work. Turner's work was just an important influence, including Turner's brushwork. The brushwork was one of the most important things that he did, that Monet did, very similar to Turner. He used this thick application of brush or of paint with a short, quick brush stroke. Monet even tried to paint in plein air here in the train station in Paris. He would stand on the railroad tracks. It was a brand new train station, so I think he thought that it was going to get less traffic than most of the train stations, and he would stand there early in the morning trying to capture the essence of the color changes in the steam engines that were releasing smoke. You can kind of just picture him standing there on the train track with this canvas trying to dodge in and out of the way of the people. If you look even more closely, you see that there is area that would normally read to you as black that is actually a very deep blue. Impressionists had this theory that black never really existed in the world, that all color has a sense of a reflection of other colors, including white. So depending on what color theory you buy into is how this works. So for some people, white is the absence of color and black is the presence of all colors. For other artists, white is the presence of all colors and black is the absence of color. It just depends on whose school of thought you go with. But the idea that black is the presence of all colors together comes from the fact that when you mix paints all together, in the end, all the colors mixed together end up being black. In addition to, they had this idea that whenever light was reflected onto something that was a dark color, the light would bounce back a set of colors. Here you see Claude Monet's wife, Camille. This painting is Camille on her deathbed in 1879. This is a reflection of Monet's inability to pay for good medical care for his wife. She was a sickly woman, and unfortunately, they just didn't have the money to eat well and to be sick like this. And so she was malnourished and very poor health care in this time of illness. They were really the byproducts of Monet's inability to sell his work. This was a problem that was shared amongst most of the Impressionists. They had a hard time selling their work. They had a hard time getting the public behind their work. With a large body of paintings of this cathedral. Here I'm showing you an image of this cathedral at a certain time of day. I would say this is in the morning sun. And then you can see the Rouen Cathedral in full day sun on a fairly bright and sunny day. Here is another image of the Rouen Cathedral with full sun blaring into the church. Notice that even though this is a Christian church, there's really no Christian content here at all. He simply wants you to look at the building as something that reflects light, and that it reflects light in different ways during different times of day. This is a body of all of those images of the Rouen Cathedral put together. You can see that he paints the cathedral many, many times. I think overall he painted the cathedral about 35 times. You can see that some of them are lighter, some of them are darker, some of them are clearer, some of them are foggier. I have seen paintings of this church up close and in person that Monet did. And I think the thing that's really interesting is the application of paint on the canvas is breathtaking and incredible all at the same time. It has this deep, thick application of paint on the canvas. Just a reminder about that vocabulary word of that application of buildup of the paint on the canvas is called impasto. Here you see one of Claude Monet's water lily paintings. This is Water Lily in the Willows. It was done in 1904 to 1917, and it is in the Paris Museum, the Musée de l'Orange. Earlier in his years, he paints this Japanese-inspired lily pond a lot. He had it installed in his country estate. And see how there's no gold frame on the right or the left of the canvas? It is because it's part of a large room that Monet specially designed for this Paris museum. It was an oval room that was going to display his water lilies paintings. Now, water lilies as a series is a series of paintings that he has many, many of. In fact, you can go to the Met and see a room of the water lilies. You can go to the MoMA and see water lilies. They are displayed fairly closely to the museum that you see here from Paris. But there's just really nothing like seeing a water lilies painting up close and personal. It is breathtaking in its own right. It's a very large painting. It is it's just something you would have to see to really understand. Why? Because the camera flattens everything out. So everything that you're looking at is a picture of the painting. And because it's a picture of the painting, you don't get to see that thick application of paint. You don't get to see the depth that is created by the Impressionist painters and the texture. The texture is something you really lose, and the texture is really important to understanding these paintings. And so I highly encourage you, if you have the opportunity to go to a museum to see Impressionist work, that you go to a museum and see it. Now, Columbus has a museum that has several Impressionist paintings that are pretty strong. But the other place, the creme de la creme of Impressionist painting displays in the United States, is at the Chicago Institute of Arts. Chicago has a lovely museum, and the Impressionist collection there, I'd say, is the most impressive collection of Impressionist work probably that I've ever seen. I'll tell you more about it in a little bit. All right, so just to sum up the stylistic features of Impressionism, because I want to be sure that this is really clear to you. This is a painting done in plein air. Impressionist compositions seem accidental and unposed. They seem accidental and unposed because they're painting a la prima. They're painting something as it happens right in front of them. In addition, with that sense of something that happens right in front of them, some Impressionist painters enjoy painting people. Renoir would be one of them. And so you see this beautiful painting of a moment in time. Also, Impressionist technique involves sketchy, rapidly applied brushwork. Here's where that impasto comes back in. The brushwork is it's almost as if you can picture the painter dabbing the paint on the canvas in your head. You can see the rapid application of paint because you can see the many brush strokes in front of you. You can see the thick application of paint. In addition to, some painters are more rapidly applying that paint than others. I think you can see it really well in this close-up of one of Renoir's works. The people seem modeled, like their faces seem like he slowed down and took a little more time, but then you can see the brushwork in the clothes seems very quick and sketchy. Why? Because there's lots of variation in the color. They're trying to record exactly what the color does in the light. Light is fleeting. It moves quickly. And so too must the Impressionist artist. Now this painting, I told you I would tell you a little bit more about Chicago. So it's time for me to tell you more about Chicago. So this painting, when you look at it on the screen, often does not seem like an Impressionist work of art. Why? Because you can't see the brush strokes. This painting is the most amazing painting. First of all, let me tell you, it's a very large painting. And when I say large, I mean like the size of a wall, large, the size of a tall wall. It's large, and when you stand in front of it, you can see the application of paint. But Cabriolet is painting on a rainy day. He's painting a rainy day. And how the light looks in the rain. Well, if you've ever sat and really studied the rain, light seems to bounce off the water. It seems to have a reflective quality. And how do we know that the most? Well, you see a puddle, the puddle's shiny, right? That's the light reflecting off the top of the puddle. But this painting seems to be able to capture the reflective nature of water on every surface. When you stand in front of this painting, because of its ability, because of Cabiolet's ability to capture that reflection of the water, you could close your eyes and almost feel the water on your skin. You can close your eyes and imagine what it's like to be in the rain there on this day in Paris in the year 1877. The streets are iridescent. The clothing has a sheen to it, just like it does when it rains. Even the umbrellas have light that bounce off of them. And you can't tell that that technique is an Impressionist technique until you stand in front of it. I remember in my undergrad seeing this painting and thinking, I just don't get why this is an Impressionist painting. And then I saw it in Chicago. And when you stand in front of this painting, it is hard to pull yourself away from it because the application of paint is just so phenomenal. It's phenomenal that Cabiolet was able to capture this reflective surface in his paint. All right, so let's start talking about our next heavy hitter. We talked about Monet. Now we're going to talk about Renoir. Renoir was essentially a Rococo painter that updated his style. His favorite subject was the Fête Galante. And if you remember what the Fête Galante was, it was an outdoor party, an outdoor romantic party, right? He often violates the Impressionists' policies. I would say he was the biggest rule breaker of all the Impressionists. The one that he violates the most is not to submit his works to the Salon. Part of that has to do with Renoir's financial status. Renoir is part of the upper class. He is the only one of the painters that really has a strong financial backing, and so he's able to socialize with the upper class. He's able to socialize in his life with the urban crowd, and he enjoys watching them. He enjoys watching the light and how it dances across their clothing in the open Paris cafes. And he enjoys quickly sketching their gestures. This is a painting by Renoir called La Loge. It's in the theater box, the Loge, or the Loge. And it was done in 1873. Now, you have to forgive me. I've told you this a million times. My French is horrible, so I apologize. This is one of the few paintings in the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874 that got positive reviews. And it's one of the few that sold. Perhaps that was because of some of the anecdotal aspects that Renoir captures in these works of art. So one of the anecdotal concepts that seem to be popular with the bourgeoisie and the group of people that buy paintings at the salon is this idea of the male gaze. So Renoir puts us in the position that he was in when he went to the opera and he is sketching this woman. He notices through his opera glasses that this woman is looking at him. She might have spotted him in her opera glasses, but she's lowered them so that he and we can get a better look at her. This idea of the male gaze is something that continues on an additional level when we look behind her and see that the gentleman behind her, who happens to be her date or her husband, is actually doing the exact same thing that Renoir is doing by gazing at other women from the Loge box, or the Loge box. We know he's looking at something. We really don't know if he's looking at someone. We do know that Renoir was looking at someone because he painted this painting of her. To some degree, having the guy behind her looking out through his binoculars or his opera glasses makes it seem as if Renoir isn't being so mischievous by painting a picture of her. Here you see the Moulin Galette. It was a fairly affordable place to write and go in the 1800s. It was named for this little French breakfast pastry that is made. It's an inexpensive breakfast pastry. It's just dough and fruit. They're called galettes. And they're tasty. They have different toppings in them. And so the Moulin Galette was someplace that the Impressionists all sort of congregated together. It is in Montmartre. We will talk much more about Montmartre here as we get more into the modernist movements. Here you see Renoir's painting of a social scene. It's where we see his Rococo-like attributes come out in terms of his style. He loves the fête galante. He enjoys being amongst his friends, dressing up and enjoying sort of this high life of leisure. It's a lively atmosphere. Oftentimes there would be live music. You see lots of dancing. And the blurred figures helps the viewer feel as if everything is moving. It creates a sense of motion, right? Because when everything's crisp and clear, it seems as if it's standing still. The blurred figures sort of create a sense that the viewer is participating in the scene because you can imagine the scene moving. You can imagine the motion of the scene. Renoir invites you into his paintings this way. Rather than being a outsider, you become a participant within the work. Here you see a close-up of the two women. They are his friends. And then you see a close-up of him. This is him drawing the Fête Galante, or sketching. There are several paintings that we have where he has done a self-portrait. Most of the other Impressionists don't do self-portraits. They're busy doing landscapes. They don't have the means to participate in these kind of celebrations. The large size of Renoir's paintings make it impossible for him to drag the canvas there and work in that plein air technique. And so he has to assemble the scene back in his studio from sketching that he's done. And so because he does that, he sits and sketches a lot. That's what he does in his time as he's there with his friends socializing. He's a flaneur. A flaneur is an independent stroller. He's a well-dressed, idly rich person, sometimes an artist or a writer, but he tends to be a detached observer of life. In fact, when you go to Paris, you see these signs that say, "Please don't loiter." Merci de ne pas flâner. The flaneur, a modern day flaneur, would be Kramer, if you are a Seinfeld fan. He's not always well dressed, but definitely leads that crazy lifestyle of being just seizing the moment, enjoying the things that come up. Just like Kramer, Renoir was often interested in fashion and the arts and nightlife and just the hustle and bustle movement of the urban life. So Degas was a flaneur who was an impressionist. He was a minority among the majority, meaning that he was a person who had more means. He had more money. He had the ability to go to the theater. He had the ability to stroll with the upper class. He had a really good work ethic. He was constantly sketching and looking and questioning the world around him. There was an endless fascination with capturing the fleeting, seeming insignificant moments of modern life, often from unusual angles. He was a Poussiniste by training. He was the student of one of Ingres' students. But he was also very heavily influenced by photography. We can see here that he translates the stop motion, the process of the stop motion picture into his photography or into his painting. So have you ever seen one of those machines that you put a image in and you vary the image slightly by each little window frame, and if you spin it, the wheel looks as if the horse runs, right? The legs move a little bit each time, and when you spin the top, it looks as if the horse runs in a circle. He's heavily influenced by this, and he uses it as a reference to create images of animals and people in motion. He really was not interested in landscape painting. He also was not interested in plein air work. He liked to return to the painting time and time again. He wanted to spend a long extended amount of time on it. And he didn't want to finish the painting in one sitting. This exotic circus entertainer is one that he really enjoyed drawing. Got the pleasure of seeing this series while I was in New York many years ago. And it was a fascinating series. He had spent a lot of time studying or watching the rehearsal for a circus. I cannot remember her name. It was disclosed when I saw the show, but she has incredible neck muscles because she is dangling from a apparatus that she holds in her teeth, and she shifts her weight around around her body to get her body to spin and to do tricks while holding onto the wire with her teeth. Degas is fascinated with this, and he likes the action. And so he decides to catch a split second of her dangling and spinning, and to sort of take a snapshot. His paintings ended up being sort of a culmination of a lot of research and sketching on his part. So he would spend a lot of time observing, and it comes out in his art because he's able to give a full visual explanation of what he sees. He said a picture is something that requires as much trickery, malice, and vice as the preparation of a crime. So, create falsity and add a touch from nature, and there you have Degas' work. The woman's performance name was Miss Lala, and she was in the Circus Fernando. This particular work of art is in the National Gallery in London. It is, it's quite a beautiful work of art. It's not that big compared to like Renoir's work. If I remember right, it was like 22 by 24. It was a smaller of the paintings that you see by Renoir, or I would say it's an average size painting for comparing to Monet. One of the things that I think you see in Degas' work so much is that influence of photography. But you also see that Degas is very good at capturing the texture and the sheen of fabric. You can see that in the performer's costume. It's nice and shiny and sort of glitzy and captures the eye. Well, there's a interesting phenomenon that is important when we look at Impressionist work, and that interest is in all things Japanese. Degas and all of the Impressionist artists, and even some of the artists that we're going to see as we go forward, had very important interest in Japanese printmaking work. It was what was the avant-garde. There was a sense of insurgence of study of the art of Japan in the late 1800s. The artists sort of went crazy for Japanese-inspired stuff. In France, there was a special term for this particular fascination with all things Japanese, and that was Japonisme. I know I have C discussion on page 829. I apologize. It's from an old edition of the textbook. So don't worry about that. I just wanted to show you the slide that had the term on it so that you could write it down and to sort of define it for you in black and white there. So there you go. You can see on the front cover that's Gustav Klimt, who was an Art Nouveau artist, was fascinated by all things Japanese as well. Japonisme was something that highly influenced the Impressionists. It influenced the Fauvists. It was a process in which the artist would carve an image into a block of wood. If you've ever taken a printmaking class, you're going to understand this completely, but if you haven't, bear with me. You could, and I'll put it in the Delve Deeper activities, you could watch a YouTube video about Japanese printmaking and about how they transfer the image onto the paper. But basically, you carve an image in a block of wood. And then, once you've taken a wood whittler tool and you've carved into the piece of wood, you then ink the wood up and take a piece of paper, lay it on top of the wood, take the back of a flat object, in my case I used a wooden spoon, and you rub the wooden spoon on the piece of paper to get the image to come through onto your paper. It's a tedious process and it takes a lot of time. The wood whittling part takes forever. And it seems as if the process just always isn't foolproof, especially the inking process in which to transfer the image onto the paper, because you have to get a nice, thorough, precise layer of ink and a precise way of transferring the image to the paper, and it can just be very tedious. At any rate, you end up with a black and white image, and then the artist will go and hand color in the print. But because it's a process that's based online, you end up with these large flat areas within the work of art. And so you get these spaces that feel flat, but then the repetitive lines tend to create a sense of perspective. This work by Monet is one in which he takes his wife Camille and paints her posing with Japanese stuff. He was very dedicated to painting in plein air, but he really is taken by Japonisme, and so he decides that he's going to paint this painting of his wife Camille here. She's wearing a blonde wig, and that's to make it 100% clear that she's a Western woman pretending to be from Japan. And you can see this beautiful silk robe that he paints for the viewer. So one of Degas' favorite subject matters is the ballerina. He was fascinated by dancers. He was fascinated by the theater. And so we see that Degas just really enjoys being part of and watching dancers. There's just something fascinating about female dancers. But how to depict them in ways that haven't been imagined yet. If, for example, here, where they're just bored and fidgeting. Or here, when they make small adjustments to things like shoes during rehearsal. For Degas, it was important that we see the endless work involved behind the art of the theater. This scene that he paints looks like a random moment, or that Degas took a picture of a scene and then converted it to a painting. But we can see that's not the case. He keeps some parts but deletes others and adds some new elements in to this version. Still, it feels spontaneous or randomly done. The leisure activities of city dwelling influenced Degas a lot. He was also influenced by Japanese prints, Japanese composition, and the point of view for a photographer for his preliminary studies of the dance scenes. So here you see a composite view. Here's a close-up of the painting without my Impressionist label across it. His paintings insist on combining viewpoints. And so when we look at his work of art, we sort of take in the raw information and fragments and glimpses of the world around us. It's really not something that anything that we look at from a broad whole perspective. It's something that we look at in small snapshots. And so he works in those small snapshots and puts them all together, and you get this interesting combination of vantage points. For example, here, you're looking at the spiral staircase, but if you were actually standing where he puts the viewer, you would see the bottom of the staircase and not the dancer's feet coming down the spiral staircase. Same with the fact that the dancers dance behind the spiral staircase. If you were standing there, you would have been able to see the entire dancer and not the top of the staircase. So we know that he's very influenced by photography. He enjoys that thick application of paint to that rapid application of paint. And here you can see that skewed sense of snapshot, where he sort of sketches the snapshot and then stitches it all together. He crops things, and it sort of is the cropping mechanism or cropping methods are something that seem to happen in photography. It's unusual for paintings in 1870 because they don't know as much about photography. It hasn't been a medium that they've really been able to explore. You see here in this particular instant, the girl on the right is sort of cut in half, and then the girl coming down the staircase represents isolated, fractured sense of image. Most paintings prior to Degas, have clear focal points. Think of Ingres' The Grand Odalisque. Here, though, you see that there's really not one specific focal point. There are three things going on in the room, and he gives them equal space in the canvas. The dance master is standing there to the right in the red shirt. There's a seated girl with her feet in second position. And in the center, we see just mostly empty floorboards. But the positive and negative spaces seem to carry your eye around the canvas, and that placement of red is really important in how we read this scene. The dance master in the background is a very strong anchor for where your eye travels through the scene in the painting. It all is mimicked through that curvilinear line in the staircase. All right, so let's move on from Degas. I hate to do it because we love Degas so much, but let's talk about Mary Cassatt. Mary Cassatt is an American expatriate. She exhibited in the 1880s with the Impressionists. Degas painted her at the Louvre. She was the only American in the Impressionist group, and she was one of only two women who were part of the Impressionist group. She was close friends with Degas, and they had some similarities in their styles. She really liked to paint scenes of women doing domestic things like giving a child a bath. Um, the men in the Impressionists group didn't feel that the relationship between the mother and the child was one that was a worthy subject matter or one that they were even interested in. But for women, her ability to work in the streets of Paris during the day and night, looking for new sides of the city, looking for new interesting things to depict, really wasn't an option. And so, because of that, being able to capture the loving relationship between the mother and the child was not only unique to Mary Cassatt, but also dictated somewhat by her gender. She imitates subject matter, but also the style of the Japonesme woodcut prints. She uses a different technique than printmaking because she is creating. She's not doing the woodblock printing technique. Instead, she's doing an aquatint etching, which an aquatint etching is a really interesting process. I will add that to the Delve Deeper activities if you're interested in doing it. Basically, you have a metal plate and you coat the plate in a waxy material, and where you want the image to come through, you don't put the waxy material on the plate. You then have a bath of acid, and you place the plate in the acid bath. And wherever the plate is exposed to the acid, you will get a texture from the acid bath. Now, you can control textures with different techniques, but that's the gist of the way aquatint etching works. Here you see Cassatt's subject definitely taking cues from Japonesme. You can see it in the flat planes of color. You can see in the linear way in which she determines the edge of something. You also see a linear focus in the way the figure is represented. Well, James Whistler was not one of the Impressionists, but he was American expatriate in Paris. He often went to London and other cities. He was an early follower of Japonesme, and he was an early proponent for art's sake. This is the idea that art really doesn't need to be about a certain set of rules. It doesn't need to be politically correct. It doesn't need to be anything in particular. To just basically be a beautiful arrangement of colors on a flat surface, and we call it art. He didn't feel like art should have rules and requirements. This is an image of Whistler's that is about the Japonesme, just like Monet that we saw earlier. He creates his own Japonesme painting with a model, but using long dark hair this time. Here again, another one of those Japonesme paintings. You can see the beautiful silk robes that the lady wears as she sits there looking at maps, I believe. Here, Whistler really is trying to illustrate this idea of art for art's sake. This is a portrait of the Victorian era writer Thomas Carlyle. But I think the point about this particular work of art is that it could be anybody sitting here. There's no indication of who this human being is. You get an idea of maybe social class status or something of that nature, but for the most part, you really don't get an idea of who this person is or why there's an image of him, a painting of him. And you don't get a sense of anything that he does in society other than the fact that he has some semblance of money because he's wearing nice clothes and because he's not doing some sort of back-breaking activity. Whistler decides that he's going to call this arrangement in gray and black number 2, Portrait of Thomas Carlyle. And I think the point in that is to just depersonalize it as much as possible. He really focuses on the colors black and gray and the lighter flesh tones to arrange the colors and make a pleasing painting. This is Whistler's mom. And again, arrangement in gray and black number 1, the artist's mother. Once again, the same type of detached, impersonal image that you see. You have no idea that this is his mother. He doesn't portray her in a tender expression. She simply turns to a side profile, and her dress and her face sort of pop out against this light green wall. But you get no emotional attachment to his mother or get the idea that the artist feels tenderly about the subject or the figure that's sitting in front of him. He said that remember a picture before being a battle horse or a nude, an antidote or whatnot, is essentially a flat surface covered with colors assembled in a certain order. The artist said this. He was writing a letter to fellow artist Maurice Denis and using his mother's portrait as an example. In the 1870s, he does a series of paintings that have interesting titles. They're based on music. They're usually called something like, nocturnes. He liked musical compositions that were based on the evening time. This one shows the Battersea Bridge in London. He, though, doesn't create an image of the Battersea Bridge in a real life representation. Instead, he does sort of his version of the Battersea Bridge. And we know that he took cues from this particular Japanese woodblock print called Hiroshige. This nocturne painting was a little bit harder to decode. It's not exactly as straightforward in terms of the story. You really have a hard time making out people standing on the shore. There's sort of semblance of a person, but you can't tell anything about the person. Once again, he's in London, and he's painting on the banks of the Thames River. He's watching fireworks go up, and the image seems to have more of an abstract feel to it because the recognizable imagery is not quite as clear and clear and communicated well. Well, I don't mean that. Communicated in a precise manner as to what's in front of him. But the image has a sense of beauty to it. It has a sense of pleasing arrangement of paint on a canvas. He he moves on from these works of art to creating an exhibition. The exhibition was done in 1878, and it was reviewed by an art critic named John Ruskin. Ruskin felt that the work didn't look finished. While I was in Detroit once, I was at a show that showcased Whistler's art, and there was a child there who had written down a comment on the cards that we as curators like to ask people, what do you think? And so the child writes down, it doesn't look finished. Well, critic John Ruskin agreed. He says, I have seen and heard much of Cockney impudence before now, but never expected to hear a coxcomb. A coxcomb is a conceited dandy. Ask 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face. Whistler claims that by John Ruskin's comment on his work, The Nocturne, that his southern pride had been wounded. He was from Massachusetts. His mother was from North Carolina. And so he sues Ruskin for £1,000 in damages. A dramatic and very case. The Whistler made a very good point that his art was one that was created through a knowledge of a lifetime. So in the late 1800s, the realists and the impressionists give up control of the realist and impressionist art historical eras and philosophies, and they hand over the sort of philosophies of the era to younger, more progressive minds, younger, more progressive artists, and they don't rely so much on the rules that the impressionists and the realists relied on. We call those artists post-impressionists. They were highly influenced by science and the innovations at the turn of the century, and they wanted their art to deal with those innovations. This is George Seurat. Seurat was academically trained. He entered the College of the Beaux-Arts from Paris in 1878. Gauguin called Seurat the little green chemist because he was fascinated with the scientific discoveries regarding color theory. He was only 31 years old when he died, and he died pretty quickly and suddenly. He was interested in complementary colors and how their juxtaposition resonated to the viewer. He revolutionized painting. He had theories about chroma and optics, the psychological perception of paint or of color. He was highly inspired by the painter Jean-Francois Millet, and his cross, he sort of adapted his ideas and style from Millet's work. He liked the subject of the peasants that Millet explored, and he liked the techniques that Millet used, like cross-hatching from very small works of art. Millet had important information on the division of color. Seurat was a master draftsman. He created lots of Conte drawings that were his way of working out how texture works. He also did lots of experimentation with trying to create sections of paintings that were light, sections that were dark. He studied how brushstroke and color being applied next to each other changes the viewer's perception. Seurat's investigations lead to a well-developed exploration of color contrast, and he eventually creates a new technique called chromoluminarism. Okay, hold on, give me just a second. Because of the juxtaposition of individual hues, contemporary critics decided that they wanted to call his chromoluminarism pointillism or neo-impressionism. In 1886, at the very last Impressionist exhibition, Seurat and a circle of like-minded painters really make a splash in the art world with their works. The main piece that was so groundbreaking was this piece called A Sunday on La Grande Jetty. I'll show you it in a moment, and we'll talk in depth about it. Seurat's main goal, though, was to be able to communicate a feeling or emotion or a representation of light and dark based on the juxtaposition of color, based on the brushstroke. In 1881, Seurat begins a series of rural studies, which the Guggenheim has now. He begins cross-hatching in terms of painting brushstrokes. They were small works of art. They were rural life scenes. And here he decides that he wants to experiment with division of color. The idea of the division of color is something that interested Seurat deeply. He knew that there were several scientific discoveries about color theory. The ideas about complementary colors and the psychological dimensions of color, the idea of how one color makes you feel, how you place one color next to another, how those things all work together fascinated Seurat. And so he decides that he's going to investigate and develop a sense of exploration in terms of contrasting color. He does this study of color juxtaposition in this painting, The Bathers. The Asneries is an industrial suburb in northwest Paris. It's along the Seine River, and this particular work shows a group of young women taking their leisure time at the river, as well as young boys and professionals. This was the first of Seurat's large-scale compositions. He drew Conte crayon studies for the individual figures, and he used live models. He made small oil sketches while he was there in plein air, and he used those to help design the composition of the final painting. He records the effect of light and atmosphere. There were 14 sketches and 10 drawings that survive. Final composition was painted in the studio and combined information from both Conte crayon studies and sketching. The chroma luminarism became a very important element in Seurat's work. He wanted to study the placement of color and the juxtaposition of color, especially the psychological effects of putting, say, red and blue next to one another or red and green next to one another. He felt like putting certain colors next to each other helped to punch up the lighting effects. Contemporary critics, though, decide to change it to calling it pointillism. So Seurat was the inventor of pointillism. We can also call this era neo-impressionism. But I would suppose the most famous of Seurat's work is called A Sunday on La Grande Jetty. Seurat is painting the Parisians captured in a moment of leisure along the banks of the Seine River. The subjects that Seurat portrays in his other major images of metropolitan life, like street musicians, circus performers, the can-can dancers, and models, really epitomize modernity. The rural-urban social themes, though, are an aspect of his work from the mid-1880s forward. He also paints port scenes and seascapes along the coastline of France. These luminous works are usually devoid of people, and they combine mosaic-like surfaces with arabesque forms. However, this particular work definitely is about people. He does, though, create the image of the person as an object, in meaning that the person is no more visually weighty than the trees. They mimic the trees in how they move from the front of the picture plane and recede into space. There's a lot of movement in this particular work of art. If you try to trace the line of direction from a person standing at the front of the picture plane, you get an interesting line that's created in terms of movement. Each set of people you can create a different line of direction with, just based on just starting with the person or the dog that sits at the front of the picture plane. This particular work of art showed up in the 8th and last Impressionist exhibition. This particular work was groundbreaking to the Impressionist exhibition. He really wanted to focus on chromatic intensity and line. He wanted to get rid of these formulaic rules that artists tended to follow in order to hang with a particular philosophy or in order to sort of rub elbows with other people that were like-minded in their theories. So these ideas were really influential from contemporaries in society. And of course, there's other schools of thought that go along at the same time, like the symbolists. And because of that, Seurat really didn't want to be pigeonholed into a certain formula for painting and for his art. He often wrote about his theories. He died of diphtheria at the age of 31. And because he wrote down the theories that he had, his writings became a very important part of his artistic legacy. This is the final painting of A Sunday on La Grande Jetty, and you can see how he's studied enough of the color to decide where he wants to punch the color up and maybe make the color softer. So he kind of does this push and pull thing with the color. He was also a landscape painter. You can see here he's painted a sailboat sailing on the Seine River. Here you can see his pointillism technique come forward even better. Pointillism is simply a technique in which you utilize the brush in a small dot-like pattern. We see lots of pointillism done when we are taking an art class, and the art class is based on drawing, like a pen and ink drawing, or a printmaking technique. At any rate, pointillism was something that Seurat invented and is an impressive addition to the history of art, but also artists worldwide in terms of technique. Another one of our superstars when it comes to post-impressionism is Vincent van Gogh. Van Gogh suffered from seizures. We think he likely had syphilis. Most of the artists at this time, if they wanted a model to draw for, they would hire models so that they could draw from the nude figure. And in order to find a model who was willing to let you draw her, you would have to go down to the local brothel and pick yourself up a prostitute. And because no respectable woman would be caught dead in your room without any clothes on modeling for you. And obviously a lot of the artists would partake in activities with the prostitute, and they contracted sexually transmitted diseases. In this case, Van Gogh had syphilis. There were many artists who had syphilis, but we think that it was what was responsible for him cutting off his ear. He typically, when one has syphilis for too long, it affects the mind and the nervous system. And we think he cut off his ear because it was constantly ringing. There really was no treatment for syphilis. And he, to some degree, had some sense of mental insanity going on. He paints this image of Starry, Starry Night. And because he was a post-impressionist painter, we often analyze what it is that he must have been thinking as he was painting. For one thing, I think he painted with this elongated line that allowed for the beautiful arrangement of the form on the canvas. You can see that your eye moves around the canvas gently. It's not jarring. It feels as if the night sky is moving and you are moving along with it. But when you get to analyze the psychological part of this painting, you realize that there are no people whatsoever in the painting. Van Gogh often felt very alone in his life. And here you can see that Van Gogh shows you how isolated he really feels. All of the homes have lights on, which means there are people home, but there's nobody outside of their home interacting with other people. And I think that Van Gogh often felt like he was on the outside looking in. One of the fascinating things about Van Gogh's artwork is that statisticians study his work. They study it because they want to write a formula that shows a prediction of how the paint is applied. So there is a mathematical formula that you can attribute to this tiny little line of blue dead center in the middle of the canvas. And then there's another mathematical algorithm that tells you when the next stroke of white is going to come up, or when the next stroke of yellow is going to show up, or when a bit of green hits the canvas. This is Van Gogh's Harvest at La Croix. This particular work of art is a lot more representational than the one that we just saw. It has a greater sense of depth, and it feels more like he's just trying to show you a story of the landscape. Another artist who we look at when we talk about post-impressionism is Paul Gauguin. Gauguin was an artist who painted colors based on how they felt. They weren't there to tell a narrative or a story. They were there to look beautiful on the canvas, but also communicate a sense of emotion. In Gauguin's case right here, I think he was communicating a sense of anxiety. You have these two people who are wrestling. This is Jacob wrestling with an angel. And they are seeing a vision. They are seeing Jacob wrestle with the angel, and they stand on as bystanders watching and praying for the outcome. You see the tree here, it bisects the picture plane diagonally, and then you see the white caps of the women sort of pop out against that red. They bridge the gap between their black dresses and the brown tree. And they define an important part of this painting, which is the positive and negative space in the painting. Gauguin paints with a concept called non-local color, a color that's not optically correct. It's a color that had the thing really happened in front of you, it wouldn't have been that color. But he's doing it to see what it is that you think and feel about the situation. So I would ask you to stop and think about, what is it that you think about this work of art? How is it that you feel when you look at it? Do you get a sense of anxiety like Gauguin wanted you to? Or does it just seem interesting to you? So Gauguin had a fascination with painting in small communities that were isolated and detached from the world. The community that you just saw the painting of with the women in the white hats was the Breton community. It was a small community in France, very much like our Amish communities or our Mennonite communities that do not live attached to the external world. They sort of insulate themselves and have their own community and own inner workings. Gauguin often traveled to a community in Tahiti called, I don't know the name of it. But the people that were there were people who were indigenous to the land. And they looked at the land as something that was precious, something that was to be loved and well cared about. He often paints this particular community in with a brown tone to the skin, but large planes of flat color. I would say more so even than the Breton society. You get these scenes that seem to be highly influenced by Japanese printmaking with their large planes of color that are separated and with a juxtaposition of another color right next to it. In addition to, there seems to be a heavy reliance on line within the work of art. The people that he studies help him to detach from his own world. He needed to detach in order to be creative. He needed to detach from the world in order to paint. So there will be an activity in the Delve Deeper to talk about Gauguin's work and how he approached it.